Sokoneza kwa makina a intaneti kukonza maphunziro othandizira kukweza bizinesi za nyumba zofalitsa mauthenga.
And now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to the next session. We already have the panelists here on stage. Our next session will take a closer look at the future of journalism education in Africa. Last year, the Reuters Institute reported on how journalism training is changing and flourishing in sub-Saharan Africa. It is noted that non-profit organizations and universities are shaping the future of journalism on the continent by focusing on new priorities. Reuters was in fact referring to a study undertaken by Fojo Media Institute and Wits Journalism Department, who attempted to map journalism training centers in sub-Saharan Africa. The NMT featured prominently in the study as an example of a non-profit organization that invests substantial resources into journalism training. Today, we have the opportunity to discuss this issue in more detail and from different perspectives.
Please welcome our panelists for this session. We have Dr. Phillip Santos, who is a senior lecturer at the Namibia University of Science and Technology, NUST. He holds a PhD in journalism and media studies from Rhodes University. His research interests are in the areas of political communication, mediated social memory, mediated discourses on conflict, identity, justice, gender and development, decolonial theory and modernism, as well as the sociology of digital mediation in contemporary society. Please welcome Dr. Phillip Santos.
All right, before we do that, let me just interrupt you there. Dr. Phillip Santos is not here.
In the room.
In the room. Will Dr. Santos be joining us?
Hopefully, he's just coming off another Zoom call, and he has the link, and hopefully he will be able to join us online.
All right. So just to clarify that, in case any of you confuse me for Dr. Santos. Yeah.
We also have Professor Franz, who is the head of the Wits University Department of Journalism. He has decades of experience in professional journalism, having worked in print and broadcasting in South Africa, Namibia, and the United Kingdom at media groups ranging from the BBC and London Guardian to East London's Daily Dispatch and the Windhoek Advertiser. He has edited the website www.journalism.co.za, served as ombud for the Mail and Guardian, and spent 10 years on the SA Press Appeals Panel. His book, Black, White, and Grey, Journalism Ethics in South Africa and the Radio Journalism Toolkit are widely used as prescribed texts at several colleges and universities in South Africa and abroad. Incidentally, Professor Kruger is spearheading the establishment of an African Educators Network to bring together journalism academics from the continent to a forum where they will exchange information as well as experiences and research. Please give Professor Kruger a warm round of applause. And facilitating this discussion is Mr. Frederico, a research fellow of the Institute for Public Policy Research and Free Expression Advocate. Mr. Links has written extensively on media and good governance and is the foremost commentator on digital rights in Namibia. Links is also the chairperson of the Action Namibia Coalition, the civil society network central to the development and passing of Namibia's access to information law. Please welcome Frederico Links.
Yeah, that sounds very good.
And last but not least, and who needs no other introduction, is Miss Zoe Titus. Please give her a warm round of applause.
All right.
Please engage as the session on the future of journalism, education, and training in Africa commences.
Thank you very much. I think we everybody can hear us all right online. I'm assuming that is the case. All right. Thank you very much. So this session that we will be looking at is a roundtable of media educators on the future of journalism, education, and training in Africa. And this is a very opportune discussion and a very timeless discussion at this point in time. But before we go into the future of journalism, training, and education, education and training, it is perhaps necessary to look at the present and the past, and why journalism education of the past and the present no longer seems to be or has diminished in relevance, because that's what the title of our session seems to intimate. And perhaps to start us off, I'd just like to sketch a situation or situations. So last week I attended the Africa Facts Summit in Nairobi, Kenya, and I moderated some discussions there. And panel after panel at the Africa Facts Summit talked about the crisis of truth and accuracy in journalism. How journalistic practice has lost touch with the basics, and how accuracy no longer seems to be a core pillar of journalism on this continent. And this is something that has come out of research around mis and disinformation on the continent. It's something that comes out of perceptions of journalists and journalism, as Afrobarometer indicates, where in Namibia, for instance, journalists are less trusted than politicians when it comes to telling the truth. This is from round 8 of Afrobarometer, which was released in 2021. Round 9 has just been released this year, in September this year, and indicates that the decline in trust in journalists and journalism is just continuing. So there's a crisis of credibility and trust. And credibility and trust cannot be removed or ignored in discussions around media viability. Because if there's no credibility and media audiences do not trust journalists or journalism or the practice, then there can be no viability. Because nobody's going to engage with media products, with journalistic products, because they do not trust them. And increasingly we see from Afrobarometer, more and more people are looking for their news elsewhere and do not engage with news media at all. This is a growing trend, and it feeds into the trend of declining and deteriorating trust and credibility. That is a very threatening perception out there amongst the public. Now, in terms of when in this specific session, I would like us to do a deep dive into why that is. Why are we facing this deterioration in trust and credibility? And what are media educators? What have we done up to this point, and what do we need to go on? What we need to do going further? And I think our panelists are very equipped to try and address these issues. Of course, we can't delve into these issues in any sort of great depth, but there is a lot of literature out there on these issues that you can read up on and take a look at. But we'll sort of try and spotlight the salient issues in this credibility and trust crisis that faces journalism in our part of the world, on the African continent. And just to add that since the first Africa Fact Summit, the number of fact checkers has increased on the continent in response to the crisis in credibility and trust. The number of fact checkers has exploded and continues to explode because of this gap that is being left by journalists abandoning in many parts of the continent, the central pillar of accuracy in reporting and conveying the information in the interest of the public. So to start us off, I think we will start with Ms. Titus and just speak to, what exactly, how do you, see this issue of crisis and trust and how it ties in, of credibility and trust and how it ties in with media viability.
Okay. You're probably not going to like what I've got to say, Frederico, because I know that you are very involved in fact-checking. I think that fact-checking is a very fundamental and central process to journalism on a daily basis. And I think that people still go, especially to legacy media, to verify news and information, and especially in this instance, print. Yeah. I know that the Afrobarometer that you're referring to, the 8th round, which at the same time also placed emphasis on the parallel trust deficit in public institutions. So there is a link there. And I think that a lot of that data came from populations and young populations who are turning their backs generally on public institutions, legacy institutions, like the media included, because they don't feel that they are represented there. This is related to many issues like representation, voice, service delivery. So that is, part of that discussion. In addition to that, that particular round of the Afrobarometer also pointed out, by the way, that whilst related to this trust deficit, whilst populations or the respondents were more keen for governments to regulate media, at the same time, they did not want to be regulated online. So, I mean, there are these, contradictions also, because at the end of the day, the media itself is but a small part or portion, or provides a small part or portion of the information disseminated on, social media platforms. It's not journalists who do that. It is the broader public who is most responsible for sharing and promoting misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. And it's unfortunate, however, that the media is at the receiving end of the scenario. Yeah. So, I mean, that's just my initial take on that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm going to leave you there. Leave your answer there and move on to to Professor Kruger around the issue of, in the context of the African Journalism Educators Network, how is the issue of this issue of the crisis in credibility and trust, how is this being addressed or discussed and looked at?
Well, you're asking very big questions, and they're obviously important questions. And there's no doubt that there is a very close connection between trust and viability, as you said. Right? People will buy products if they trust them. I do think that Zoe's point around the murkiness of the information ecosystem is really important. And I don't want to be seen to be finding excuses, right? But I do think we need to do more to unpack how much of the distrust is really earned by journalism and how much of it is simply reflected distrust because people see a lot of rubbish on social media and just assume, well, that's coming from journalism. And I mean that as a serious question. You know, I think we really need to do more to understand those kinds of dynamics. And I think it speaks also to a need to rethink the way in which we position ourselves in that information
space,
ecosystem.
Exactly.
I mean, Guy made the point earlier that we continue to need institutions, and I think that's an important point. How do we make it clear to a wider public this is trustworthy and this is not? And that's a very fundamental and very big point. I also think that we need to be careful to see trends too quickly. You know, I mean, I think it's easy to say, oh, well, in our day, everything was wonderful. And now look at the young generation. They don't care about facts. I'm not sure that that stands up always. And I think particularly there is a real danger of importing a trend that is very visible in the global north, where you see local newspapers visibly closing, and assuming that the same applies simply across Africa. And we do have problems, right? In South Africa, we've seen in Kenya, Nigeria, and other markets, where there is real economic stress, and we've seen closures and job losses. But the crisis of journalism is, in our context, is an older crisis. The precariousness of being a journalist, the fact that you don't know where your money is going to come from, the fact that there are media freedom issues, is not due to this new kind of social media world. It's an older problem. And I think until we understand the problem in those terms, I think, we may be looking in the wrong direction. I'm not saying it's one thing or the other. I think it's very complicated.
Yeah.
But to come back to your question about the journalism educators, look, I think that there are a lot of implications of this new environment, which includes implications for trust, for viability, for all sorts of things that we need to grapple with as journalism educators. And as a Jen, we're beginning to discuss those things. And it is about what happens to our graduates, right? Where do they go? There's the assumption that you train young people and they go and find a job in a newsroom and then that's what they'll do for the next little while. And that's not always the case. They become freelancers. They move into community media. They move into communications jobs, all sorts of other places. And I think there is a different set of skills that young people need to do that. Skills of looking after your own reputation, skills of negotiating a decent price for a freelance piece. All those kinds of things that I don't think we've really thought about sufficiently. And I think finally, I think that there's also a need really to think about different target groups. Not only the young people who want to become full-time journalists, but other people who may need journalistic skills to operate in this new kind of undifferentiated information ecosystem. And a lot of other people want to work there and are working there. And I think we have something to offer. I'd like to say something about universities, but let me just stop there.
I think, we'll get to that because I wanted to
add. Sorry, if I may.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Franz, for example, I think that there used to be a very valuable course at Rhodes University. It's a kind of transition course for, let's say, someone with an economics background or economics qualification who needed the journalistic skills or the journalism skills to progress in their career. And I think increasingly maybe we need to look at a kind of collaboration there in terms of that kind of course and the general media literacy skills that everyone needs in this kind of ecosystem. One of the things that we would really love to see is that media literacy becomes part of our most basic curriculum, starting at grade 1 or even earlier, because this is a kind of environment that toddlers are growing up in, and they need to become more critical consumers of media.
I think it's a very consequential problem for the media because especially journalistic media. What makes journalistic media valuable to audiences is their credibility, if one may put it that way. It is their this trust that audiences have in the media to make available information that is useful for them to make life and death decisions in some cases, or consequential decisions in terms of how society is organized. And the moment people start questioning whether or not journalistic media are providing them with the necessary facts that they need to make these decisions, then that relationship becomes heavily compromised, the relationship between the media and audiences. And once the media loses its audience, I mean, which is the very basis on which advertisers would consider whether or not to advertise with the media, then their viability becomes compromised in a very significant way. And regaining trust after losing it is much more difficult. So losing that trust is the easiest thing. One bad story, one piece of disinformation, one cause for people not to trust the media can destroy whatever reputation that media built over years, if not decades, with huge consequences on the sustainability of such media. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Santos. So I'm going to just throw it back at our panel here in terms of, so how do we concretely and appropriately, adequately respond to this in terms of training? Zoe, in terms of the Namibia Media Trust as a non-profit organization, what are you doing to concretely, tangibly respond to this? And then Professor Kruger and Dr. Santos, so the responses from within academia to this crisis. What is happening and in this space?
So I've got a PowerPoint that I want to refer to. I hate PowerPoints too. So, but it's going to help me get through the couple of points that I want to make. So I've got this thing here. There we go. So a couple of years back, 2019, 2020, the Namibia Media Trust, the NMT, undertook a training needs assessment for Namibian journalists. At that point, okay, how does it? Oh, yeah. Up until that point, we were doing workshop-based training, very ad hoc training, not a formalized program, but it was based on specific needs identified by journalists. But I mean, we really felt that we needed to consolidate that and to expand our training program, because when the trust ventured into that, based on the consultations with our board of trustees, they really placed journalism training or journalistic training as a prominent objective of the trust. So we thought we wanted to formalize that, and through that we established the NXT, Next Journalism Hub, and you can see one of our banners over there for the hub. And in order to inform ourselves of the needs of journalism, I mean, we have to work from an evidence-based perspective. We undertook this training needs assessment. Okay. So our goals and objectives, they were to get information about the level of involvement in training of journalists in the past years. We put out a survey to identify, thank you, to identify the training needs, regardless then of professional levels, and the type of media in which journalists worked at the time, and their satisfaction with current levels of training, and then also seek recommendations for training priorities. And we did the survey and developed it in such a way that it could potentially be upscaled and used as a tool for, in other countries. So, I mean, it would be, a useful and relevant tool for others interested in this. So this is just some socio-biographical information, of how of the respondents and the age groups. So you can see most of the journalists in Namibia are between 31 and 40 years, and then later. So it gives us an indication that we have many more older journalists, and we are, and also still many in the 41 to 50 age group. And in terms of gender, this is the makeup. I was surprised by this. I thought there were many more women journalists in Namibia, I mean, than the 53% that we saw. This is a breakdown of existing qualifications, those with postgrad degrees, undergrad and matric level. You can see there that most journalists at the time had an undergraduate degree, but postgrad studies are quite important for journalists. So we asked the question about the skills requirement for employment as a journalist and whether formal education is adequate preparation for the current job, and this was the feedback: somewhat adequate. That is a reflection on, how relevant the training is to the skills actually needed in the newsroom. And here, we've asked consistently, what do we really need in terms of training? And this is the feedback from the working journalists to the media managers to the editors, the fact that basic news gathering and reporting skills. So, I mean, there's a need for a turn to the basics. The multimedia skills in the new environment, obviously very important to be able to write for different platforms. But at the end of the day, you need the basics, the foundational skills. I mean, this is not an absolute train smash. It affirms, I think, what to a great extent what we've always known, that the basics form the foundation. And the very important crucial skills then again for upgrading and training of journalists, again the basics, news gathering and reporting, interviewing skills, research, and just pitching story ideas to your editor. I mean, as you can see from the data. For us, it was very important to understand the kind of formats that journalists wanted. And we were doing a lot of one-day or maybe longer workshop-based training, which is good and appreciated. I mean, we are very sensitive to the fact that based on the the sizes of newsrooms, the shrinking newsrooms, it's very difficult for an editor to release a journalist for an entire week for a training course. But still, face-to-face training is very important. We've dabbled with e-learning, and COVID has, proven that e-learning or online learning is incredibly important. But and it's reflected there. But importantly, accredited training. Journalists want accredited training. And that's probably the major takeaway that we took from this from this research. So we've come up with some recommendations which you can read there. I'm not going to go through that. by the way,
Is there
this,
somewhere where people can view this?
yes, it is available. It's online, and we have your contact details here. I assume you've registered. We will just share it with you via email, or send you a link via WhatsApp to where you can download this study. So the one thing that I think the important thing that we've taken away from this is that issue of accredited training. So we are currently engaging with the NQA National Qualifications Authority, the National Training Authority, in a long, protracted process of getting accreditation. So the important thing here is that we need to know, and based on this research that we've also undertaken, it would be pointless for us as a nonprofit to compete with tertiary institutions. So we are targeting our training at the NQF 4, 5, and maybe 6 levels.
Basics level.
That the basics level. So that if you want to continue after that certificate and move on to, you know, a degree at a tertiary institution, that option is available to you. But the difference here and the value add that we present is the fact that ours is practically oriented. We are looking to work very closely with media institutions. This journalism is a very practically oriented profession trade. And we have our linkages with a newsroom, with a printing press, and a radio station. So this apprenticeship that we are developing is practically oriented, and it will, I think, prepare you to a great extent for the actual practice of journalism.
Right.
We want to develop it in such a way. Sorry, this is a long
Yeah,
bit. We want to develop it in such a way that this would be the preferred, or at least initially preferred program feeding into the newsrooms.
All right, thank you very much for that, Professor Kruger.
Thanks. And thanks for that really interesting overview of your results here in Namibia. Let me first say that I think it's useful for us to think about different kinds of institutions offering different kinds of things and playing to their strengths.
Yes.
I mean, I think it was Peter Deslers who earlier said universities can be really inflexible. And it's absolutely true, right? I mean, that sort of nimbleness that an organization like NMT can display is really hard for universities. I think universities also have strengths. You know?
For sure.
I mean, I think universities have the strengths of offering the kind of accreditation that young people and their parents, remember, parents are big players in all of this, want, right? I think universities can also, when they do things well, offer a kind of critical thinking, which goes beyond just the hard skills of operating a camera and so on. And I think that has real value. But I think, as I say, I think we need to, in a sense, look at a landscape and see who can do different things. And it's like an ecosystem of training providers. In fact, the mapping study that you referenced earlier, or that was referenced earlier, you know, makes that point. I mean, at Wits, we've always wanted to combine practical training as well with critical thinking. So our students produce. There is a radio station. There is a weekly newspaper. There are all these things. We have strong connections into industry. We also have programs that are directed at working journalists, for degrees as well as for short course certificates around particular skill areas. But I want to come back to your initial question by asking a question, and it is this: we tend to conflate journalism and communication, and isn't that the problem? right? Because when you're teaching communications, I mean, and this is not a judgment, right? I mean, communicators do really useful and worthwhile work, but it is strategic, right? I mean, it's often called strategic communication. You're going into a company to tell that company's story. And to me, that's fundamentally different to journalism. And I wonder whether the route, to come back to your point about trust, is to draw that line more sharply. Yes. To say, we're teaching journalism and it's about values. You talked a lot about skills, right? Journalism is about values. It's about serving a public interest. And it is in that sense distinct. It's something different. I don't want to pose that as too hard a question. I would be really interested, particularly the students here, to weigh in on that. Because of course, the benefit of getting a journalism/communications qualification is you're marketable in a much wider market, right? You can go and apply for all these other jobs. Journalism jobs are getting fewer. They're hard to get. So it has that kind of downside. But I would be really interested to get people's views on whether we should draw that line more sharply.
Yes, I think that is an issue that some of us on this panel are fully in agreement with that sentiment and that you pose in that question. Dr. Santos, perhaps you could address that issue also in your response and where you stand in terms of that question around journalism is just a facet in sort of communication. Are you, Dr. Santos, are you there? Yes.
Yeah. So if you can hear me. Yeah. So I think the question, if I got it correctly, is what academic institutions doing to address this credibility gap, this challenge of trust in the media? What training interventions can be infused to capacitate journalists to compensate for that? I think my co-panelists have highlighted some of the key issues. Zoe has even offered something of a training manual to offset some of those challenges. But I think one of the things that we often ignore about journalism are the structural factors, which is that journalists, despite their intentions as individual professionals, they work in institutionalized frameworks which have their own logics, which logics have a determining effect on how they will report on issues. So for instance, something as simple as editorial policing on the one hand, and as complex as the networks of funding that a media organization may find itself integrated in can have a huge impact on how it covers issues, what issues it covers, how it covers those issues, and how such practices can shape the relationship between audiences and the media. So I think part of the training that journalists themselves need is to understand these dynamics, these structural dynamics, and how they translate into their own practice in the field, and how they can, through the urgency that they can claim through their professional commitments, sort of resist the way structure tends to impose itself on practice. That's the one point that I thought we need to keep at the back of our minds. Then the second one would be to reimagine journalism itself, to think outside the mainstream operations. Of course, this has been happening both in practice and also at the level of pedagogy. There is a lot of talk around alternative journalisms, alternative spaces through which information, key information that is useful for enriching democratic practices and societies can be filtered into the public sphere. But also these alternative channels tend to face their own risks, funding, which is the key factor. We were having a chat with Zoe the other day following the closure of New Frame, which is a very progressive online outfit in South Africa, but which has since folded because of, again, challenges with regards to funding. So that is one thing that probably both within journalism schools and also other spaces where journalism can be reimagined, is something that we need to think about. How do we create parallel communicative spaces which are not significantly affected by vested interests that tend to have a determining effect on the content that the media creates, and which in turn shapes the relationship between the media and audiences. That would be, I think, my contribution for now.
All right. So, yes. Yeah, yes, with that, I think we'll open up the floor to the discussion, the floor online and here in the room. Gwen, please go ahead.
Sorry. Okay.
Just introduce yourself first.
Apparently.
And I just want to, please just indicate if you're making a comment or you're asking a question.
Frederico, a little bit of both, because I do want feedback from the panel, but I think, sorry, Gwen Lister, everybody, I don't know what I am these days, but veteran journalist probably. Just to touch on very briefly what Franz said about university education in the sense of journalism and communications, the mix. I've got history with that, and I agree 100% with Franz, going quite a long way back to when what was it called? The academy became the Polytech of Namibia, later the university, but when it was transitioning to Polytech, and later, and also when the University of Namibia was starting up, I was on a committee that was looking at this very question of journalism and mass communications and whatever. And I argued very strongly at the time for a dedicated journalism degree, not to confuse it with communications. And it seemed as though the donors or the funders at the time were very intent on exactly that. So I didn't get my way and I left those two committees. But I do think that it has caused probably a lot more harm than it has caused good. Not that we haven't turned out some excellent journalists from those two institutions, but there's a lot of confusion among the young people who are studying in those areas, and they do confuse public relations with journalism, which are diametrically opposite, as Franz just mentioned. The other thing is we talk about the journalism of today. I mean, I remember a time decades ago when most of us were journalists who had a notebook and a pen. And later they said to us, but you may need to take your camera as well. And we said, but we journalists, we're not photographers. And now in this new media environment and the digital space, journalists are expected to be jack of all trades, put it bluntly. They've got to write the story, do the story, take the photograph, post to social media, sometimes do a video, do an interview. And I wonder whether in the process we're not losing sight of journalism as a craft, and that we could also bring in here the topic of artificial intelligence and to what extent that is going to be used in the future in the newsroom to do a lot of those tasks that journalists today are being required to do. But I think we must be very careful going forward to ensure, because quality journalism is so important to rebuilding trust, that we need to get back to a time when a journalist is a journalist and not a social media influencer or whatever else they're required to be in this day and time. And maybe universities need to structure the courses accordingly. And that's why training now of journalism is happening outside universities and polytechs, because it's more focused on the business of journalism rather than all these other extraneous things. But it would be nice, I agree with Franz, to hear if we have any journalism or communication students here to hear what their perspectives are.
Yes.
I mean, Zoe and I get a lot of young students from both of those institutions wanting help with assignments, and it's very clear they're confused. And that ultimately, when they go into newsrooms, is going to affect the quality of journalism. So it's a question and a comment.
Yeah,
Thank you.
And I think there's a criticism in there of
That too.
tertiary
That too.
level education of journalists. Yes. So yes, there's a question there, and please let us know if there are any questions online.
Afternoon, colleagues. My name is Teresa Lucas, and I am currently a journalist at NMH. So this is a bit embarrassing because, funny enough, I did study communications, and I have a bachelor's degree in communications. So what I realized is that when I got into the newsroom and when writing stories, I was more focused on writing a compelling story and selling a particular narrative than telling facts. You understand? So I was more focused on that. And later on, through practice and through more writing, I realized that as a journalist, I need to present facts and not necessarily sell one side of the story or the story that I particularly like.
All right. Any comments or questions online that we need to grapple with? Perhaps we can, Professor Kruger, perhaps you would like to respond to what Gwen said there?
I mean, I think we're seeing from roughly the same hymn sheet. I don't think it's exactly the same hymn sheet. Because I think, I don't think it's always tertiary institutions that are at fault and non-tertiaries that are getting it right. Because, I mean, I think it's about how you think about what you're teaching. And what is so interesting about your contribution, I mean, what I'm hearing you say is that you emerged from the communications degree with technical skills, but what you needed to learn were the values, right? Yeah. The values of journalism. And that's not just, and that's, I suppose, what I would say to the NMT initiative, is it's not just about craft skills. No. It's not just about apprenticeship. It's about understanding what you're doing for society, and being able to manage your own prejudices and understanding ethical decision, kind of considerations and right. There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes with that. And it's worth remembering that education is not just about skills; it's about values. It's about values, about attitudes, and those kinds of things. And that's an important component that I think wherever we sit in this ecosystem of teaching and skills development, we need to really take on board.
Yes. Microphone.
Yes, thank you, Guy Berger here. I'm just worried that you seem to me to be thinking in an old paradigm, that journalism is somehow pure. The reality is journalism is losing because it's pure, because it's boring, because it can't compete with fun, because people don't see it as a product, because journalists don't have social influencer skills. So shouldn't we wake up and try and merge these two, fuse them, without losing the soul of journalism? But I just think that you're harkening back to an industrial model, which is a bit mythical and which is not succeeding today.
Yes, so let me ask Guy, before he loses the mic, what then is the soul of journalism that you're talking about? What is it that we must hold on to?
Well, I think the soul of journalism is aspiration to tell the truth and public interest. And I think you can do that. No, but I think Trevor Noah is doing that. Yeah, now, do you say he's not a journalist because he brings character, personality, he's an expert in marketing? I'd say he's doing journalism. It's not this boring journalism that we know of. It's not industrial journalism, but the guy is very skilled and talented and probably trained in how to do all these things. So we have to look at new models like that.
Yeah.
I'd like to respond to that, but
There's a question over there. And then we have an online question. Let's deal with the online question first before we get to the question here in the room. Yes.
Yes, facilitator, we have Anderson Fumulani who would like to make a contribution on a crisis of trust. Mr. Anderson Fumulani, you may go ahead, yes.
Thank you. Hello to everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to contribute to the issue around the crisis of truth, the issue of trust in the media. It reminds me, 2 years ago, the Misa Malawi, Misa Zambia, and Misa Zimbabwe carried out a study in the 3 countries and established exactly what Zoe was presenting, that there was a lot of lost trust in the media. And so we quickly developed some modules to conduct some training in the 3 countries. And unfortunately, it was during the peak of COVID-19. So we used some unorthodox means to enter into Zambia and conducted some 2 training sessions and 1 in Malawi. But what I discovered, for example, was that it's about going back to the basics of journalism, because the people who are in the field already seem to forget where they're coming from and the things that they learned in the basics time. And you find that when we introduced those things back, it was like they looked so surprised, as if these things they have never learned them before. So it's about sticking to the basics. While someone is improving their skills, they should not forget the basics, the requirements that you follow when you learn basic journalism, which brings me now to the question of viability and viability and ability. And I think one thing that I hope is going to be discussed is we have seen a lot of radio stations being closed down in Malawi because they are struggling to subscribe to the regulatory authority. And I think one gets the impression that perhaps they've lost their clients, they've lost their customers because of their credibility, and therefore their viability is compromised. They don't get more business, which brings me back to another aspect to say, apart from looking at the technicalities of producing good journalism, what about the business side of making it that this is a business we are into and we are all scrambling for the same market? What is it that we are missing, that we are not doing properly about the business of journalism practice? That's what I wanted to contribute and stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fumalani. So there's a question there. So there's a question in the room as well. Can we just go to that question?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. My name is Franz colleague. I work as a freelance. So I think for me, as the panel are expressing themselves, I was just thinking this question of impact. Maybe one would really consider, if you see society and the issue around social media, whether it's TikTok, WhatsApp, Facebook, YouTube, there's quite a wide interest among society to use such platform. And maybe this is the question in terms of journalism and education, how they are triggered to capitalize such audience. And I think that's where the gap is. And this question of viability, if it's not linked to society interest, the question of viability will hit hard media house and across. And I think I'm trying to understand, perhaps, if panel can react on the question of impact that journalists in total have to play in marketing the thinking of society and create an impact in that credibility. So it's just a question around that. Thank you.
All right. I think there's a lot been said there in these last few commenters and questioners. Would the panel like to respond to some of these points and questions?
Okay, I'll start. I'm just glad Gwen and Guy are sitting on different couches.
Yes, it was very obvious that you're on opposite ends of this discussion around the models. Yeah.
I think Peter also had a question or a comment. I think we lost. Yeah. I think that, you know, it's not a black and white issue. I think we need to find a middle ground. I deeply appreciate, you know, the practical training apprenticeships, but I fully appreciate also the rigor of academia, and these two cross-pollinate each other. And I think if a journalist during your career, during the course of your career, have the experience of both, it just makes you a better journalist. It improves your ability to provide analysis, because I think that is one of the things that audiences or readers or listeners or whatever you want to call them want more and more from journalists. They want you to go and do the story, to provide the information, but they also are expecting a level of analysis from journalists. And that, if you provide good analysis and informed analysis, that is linked very closely with trust and regaining that trust. I'm sure Franz has more to add.
Professor, please go ahead.
Thanks. I just wanted to pick up on the last point briefly. If I'm understanding you correctly, you're asking about impact of journalism on social, particularly in a social media environment, right? So, I mean, I think you're answering your own question in a sense. I think it's critical for journalists these days to understand the environment and to operate within it, and to use, you know, whatever platforms there are to achieve as much impact as you possibly can, particularly if you're a freelance, as I think you said you are. I mean, it's a complicated territory. I mean, I spent 10 years as a freelance before social media. It was a different world. It is a complicated area, but I think that's, you know, it's certainly important to understand these things and to operate there. I hope I've addressed to some extent. I mean, maybe other panelists will pick up on this discussion further. I just want to say to Guy that I'm a little bit surprised to be interpreted as calling for boring industrial journalism. I didn't think that it was something that I was arguing for. I mean, clearly people like Trevor Noah do a kind of journalism. And I mean, we didn't really get into that, but I think one of the really interesting things for journalism training providers of various kinds to do is to think about the different role players that are doing journalism without being journalists. And some of it is boring. Some others of it isn't boring. And to see what we can do, and it comes back to my point about quality and about public service, you know, what we can do to improve the quality of that information that's out there. Let me stop there. I wonder whether there's a really, I mean, I don't know this, but it seems to me that there may be a very interesting side conversation happening in sign. And it would be really nice if the sign interpreter could just give us some sense of what that discussion is.
You switch on this, yeah.
Thank you for the opportunity. But yeah, what I was actually saying was, my name is Beata first and foremost, Armas. What I wanted to actually ask was about, for example, when we have journalists now, or maybe when people are using technology or social media. What I wanted to find out was if, for example, sometimes you read newspaper articles, and so when people are now using these newspapers, there are times I think when they don't think about persons with disabilities, because when they advertise positions, for example, sometimes you find that they ask you to use all the social media platforms for you to apply. And like I think last week we were in a meeting with people with visual impairment who were complaining that their needs are never taken into cognizance when it's really via print media, because most of them can't use technology to be able to perhaps access the information that is placed on social media. And so how are we thinking about those with visual impairment when we do articles on newspapers like job advertisement? Perhaps maybe what we can do, I don't know whether it's possible for us to incorporate Braille into a newspaper or into media work or journalism work to cater for those with visual impairment. And that's the first point. The other one that I wanted to just add on was in the morning we were discussing about how journalists are now, sometimes you need to go to a story and to become a videographer. You must also post on social media. So then I just thought of how is that possible? For example, how can someone who has no skills do videography, still post for social media, write a newspaper, I mean a news article? Because what people are complaining now is that sometimes you find maybe an accident has happened, the family is not even aware that a family member was involved in an accident, and then you find, I don't know whether to call them journalists that someone will just take a video or a picture and then disseminate that information without perhaps asking permission from the family members whether they can send through the info on social media. And then you find family members only find out later what has transpired, because someone perhaps has come across an accident and then they decided to disseminate the information without prior knowledge of family members. I think just how to work around those things. Are those journalists now called citizen journalists? So sometimes I think the commission is where we confuse them with now the professional journalist. Also just maybe an endpoint way. I need clarity on those two.
Yeah,
Frederico,
perhaps,
we're
yes.
10 minutes into the next session. Maybe we can just have one response on that and then move on.
Yeah. No, I think let's
I know
the questions. Those questions that you asked are very specific questions, and I think there is something on citizen journalism where it will be addressed, and the pitfalls and shortcomings and the differences between that and professional journalism. So you can look forward to that session. I'd like to say thank you very much to our panel. Perhaps Dr. Santos, is there something you just wanted to say to end off our panel discussion, because we haven't heard from you in a while?
Okay, thank you. I heard some of the comments which I found interesting, like for instance, the idea of emphasizing crafting training. It's a good idea, but it also turns journalists into chroniclers of stories, sort of, they just tell things. And the world we live in today, I think, is so sophisticated that mere presentation of facts is no longer enough. There is so much information out there, some of it very complex for an average citizen. Much of it needs some degree of interpretation. placement in context. And the reason why we now have new forms of journalism, such as data journalism and so on, is primarily because there is need for some degree of speciality in dealing with large volumes of information, which an average citizen wouldn't be interested in, let alone understand if they were to deal with the primary data that itself. So journalists need, there is a need for them to be much more sophisticated, not only in terms of understanding the craft of presenting stories to the audiences, but also understanding the issues that they are talking about and how these issues are integrated into the global flows of not just of information itself, but also of power, if I may put it that way, how people are relate to each other across various matrices of power and things like that. And this is very important around topical issues that we are confronted with today: climate change, inequality, racism, and so forth and so forth. These are not the kinds of stories that can just be told by merely chronicling facts about events that are happening right now, but that need to be understood both in their historical context and their contemporary manifestations in terms of that history, and so on and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Santos. And I think we'll end it there. As you probably have heard, this is a very complex and sophisticated discussion we're having here about the future of journalism, education, and training. And I think we're still going along, as we're going along, trying to figure out a lot of what needs to be done, because the fate of journalism is something that is still playing out. We don't know where it's going, what's what the end point is here. So with that said, please do continue being part of these discussions and engage in them actively. And I'd like to thank the panel for consenting to be here and be interrogated and making the valuable points that have been made here. Thank you very much. And yes, let's continue the discussions. There's a lot out there that you can read, of course, about everything that has been said here. And I do encourage you to read, to be up to date on what's happening in the field of journalism, in the field of journalism training as well. Thank you very much. And
may I just add something? Yes. I think we probably even forgot to tell Bradley that, this is all being live streamed, and the entire video of today's proceedings will be edited during the course of the afternoon, the evening, and will be on our YouTube page early tomorrow morning. So you can always go back and refresh your memories about everything that's been discussed here.
All right, thank you very much. That's the end of this discussion.
Kusokoneza kwa makina intaneti. Kukonza maphunziro othandizira kukweza bizinesi za nyumba zofalitsa mauthenga.